I bet you want to learn how to become a way better software engineer. You know, I do too. And one of the things that you need to understand is it's not just being able to write code and solve problems, but it's being able to write code in a way that other people can read, that you can read, and that your code is easy to maintain. So in this lesson, we are going to take the weather app we made in the last video, and we are going to make this program modular. We're going to look at ways we can improve this, make it easier to read, and we can use some of the best software engineering practices available. So the weather app in the last video, as I already said, we did not spend really any time on architecting the application in the most intelligent way. So that's what we're going to do today. Part of being a software engineer is learning how to refactor your code. Do you know what that means? The name makes it sound pretty obvious, but you're going to take code you've already written, you're going to look at it, and you're going to improve what you didn't do quite well. You're going to make things faster, more efficient, and more secure. And today, we're going to refactor this application that we previously made. So the first thing you're probably going to notice as you're watching my screen share today is the directory structure of our application has changed slightly. And that is because we use the Dart Create tool to create this project. The Dart Create tool creates all the files you need, puts them in the path you want, and makes it easier and faster for you to set up your application. We're actually going to make a completely separate video on how to use this tool, but for now, just know that is why the directory structure is different. So as we're looking through our code, I can see one thing that we can definitely improve. And that is the way that we call our API. Before, we had all the functionality for calling the API right here in our void main async function. But I want you to notice something. Instead of that, I have added await call weather API. I've actually created a function to handle our API usage for us. Now remember, when you're creating a function, you're making reusable code that generally serves one purpose and serves it well. Why did we do this, you ask? Well, I would rather have a function that says exactly what's going on in our main code, and then we're abstracting that complicated code away from whoever's viewing the application later. So if somebody comes in here to work on it, they're going to look at this line and they're going to know exactly what you're doing. Let's take a real quick look at our call weather API function and see what we did. So as you notice, we're passing a string called zip code. We have made this function async because we're going to have to use the await function. So here, we're just declaring our API, as we did before, our API URL. We're getting our response. We're using the HTTP package to get a response from that URL, and we're returning the response. So it's literally the exact same code, but it's actually being returned in one line, and more importantly, in a way that's very easy to read. So how else can we improve this application and make it a bit easier to read? Well, if you're looking at our void main function here, I notice we have this if response code equals status 200 logic in here. Why don't we split that all up and put that inside of the call weather API function? Let's see how we can do that. Now we're inside of the call weather API. We still have the previous code here, but instead of just automatically returning response, we have if response status code equals 200, we're going to return response. Else, we're going to throw an exception. Now that means that we can actually go ahead and remove a lot of this code. So now we've removed this if-else statement from our main void function. So all of the error checking that we currently have is taking place right inside of this one line. Now we're going to want to run our code to make sure that this is still working. So the file that I'm working in right now is called weather2-3.dart. All right, let's test our code to make sure it still works. Okay, everything still works. We're looking good. Now that we're looking at this call weather API, there's one more thing that I'm noticing. You can see that we're checking to see if our response status code is equal to 200. And if we are returning the entire response. Otherwise, we are throwing an exception that says API returned a non-200 status code. But something occurs to me. We don't need our function to be returning the entire response because all we need is the body. So why don't we go ahead and just change this to response.body and test our code one more time to make sure that it still works. Holy cow, look at this bleeping error. What is happening here? What is going on? This error is occurring on line 29 of our file. What might be happening here? Let's take a look. Line 29. Oh, I see what it is. We have our map that we call JSON data, and if you look at JSON to code, we're still trying to pass response.body into it, but that doesn't work because we're just returning response.body. So now let's go ahead and let's remove that, and now we just have response. Now let's test our code and see if it works. Okay, it's fixed, it works, but now you'll notice we have these two lines of code here that actually replaced quite a bit of previous functionality. Our app isn't what we would say easy to read yet, but it's getting better. Let's keep refactoring. Looking at our application, I noticed that we have this do while loop here. I wonder if we could get this down to one line of code. Let's look at how we might do that. Notice how we're using get zip code function here. Well, if I recall, and if you recall, there's also a do while loop inside of the get zip code function. So why are we duplicating a do while loop here? Let's go take a look. You can see here we have do while, we're going to write the zip code, while zip code dot is empty. I bet we could combine these two do while loops into one. So what if we changed our function to look like this? We have our do while loop and we have zip code dot is empty like before, but then what if we add or is zip code format valid? So this way it's executing both of those checks in one do while loop that's nested away beautifully inside of this get zip code function. That to me seems like it will allow us to simplify our code. Then if you notice, all we need to do is call this line, zip code equals get zip code, and all that looping functionality is taking place inside of this function. So in our void main file, all we have now is zip code equals get zip code. All of that has been abstracted away. So for a developer or a programmer or your future self looking at this, it's going to be very clear what's happening. So I want to test this application to make sure it still works. Every time you make a change that significantly alters structure or functionality, I really do recommend testing. So let's see, we're going to enter the zip code. Great, everything still works. So I'm noticing something here that I don't really like that much. I want to point out that how you name your variables and functions is really important, because if you have poorly documented and commented code and you don't have your variable names making sense, you're going to run into situations where you're not exactly sure what is happening. So I personally don't really love that we're using this variable named JSON data. That's actually super generic and hard to understand, so let's see how we can improve that. And while we're improving that, this variable response doesn't look that great to me either. So what if we try to do a few things all in one fell swoop? What if we take these two lines of code and we try to turn them into one, and at the same time, we make these variables make just a little bit more sense? So you'll notice what I've done here is create a variable called weather data. And inside of weather data, I have the JSON decode function, but instead of calling another variable, I'm having it directly call the call weather API based on the zip code. And please note, I'm using the await method because we have to await call weather API before we can run JSON decode. We are able to elegantly have a variable named here that makes a lot of sense and run all of our functionality by nesting these things inside of each other. Now I will add one small note. If you nest a function within a function within a function too deeply, it can be super confusing to read. But for a situation like this, it makes a lot of sense. Now that we've renamed this weather data, we also need to update our print statements to change our variable here that used to be JSON data to weather data. Let's run a quick check and just make sure everything is still functioning properly. Fantastic, it looks great. Now, I wonder if you guys are noticing the same thing I am. I'm seeing these two print statements here and I'm wondering, couldn't we just have the current weather print using a function instead of two statements? Let's see how we can execute this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a void function, since I'm just using the print statement, called print today's weather. And I'm going to be passing in a map. Remember, a map is a key value pair where the key is a string and the value is dynamic. And I'm going to call it weather data. And then inside of here, we're simply going to copy and paste our two print statements from above. So everything here is exactly the same. The beauty of it comes when we come back up here to our main function, and we can see instead of these print statements, we actually just have this one function called print today's weather, where we are returning the weather data. Look at how easy this is to read. We're printing out a statement, we're getting our zip code, we're getting our weather data, and then we're printing today's weather using our weather data. This is beautiful, but of course, we do need to check to make sure that all of our new changes are actually functioning properly. It appears that they are. While our code is changing to become more easy to read and efficient, our application is functioning exactly as expected. Now you're probably going to be asking yourself, why am I spending the time taking two print statements and putting them into their own function? Well, I'm going to tell you there's a couple reasons. The first is that if this application gets more complex and you want to print the today's weather in different locations, you can just call this function instead of copy and pasting print statements. The second is that this makes our application easier to read and understand for other people or our future selves. And the third is just for straight up practice. I want you to practice splitting your app into modules and functions so that you can do this better when a big application comes along that actually is going to require a lot more of this. Let's browse through our application and see what else we might fix. Well, I'm noticing this date time forecast date and the function that turns it into the day of the week would be very easy to abstract away into a function. So why don't we see how to do that? So I'm going to define a new function called string, because that's what we're going to return, a string like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, called getDayOfWeekName. And in here, we're going to pass a string called date. And that's because the date of year, month, day we're getting back from the API is in string format. So then we're going to use our date format class here. We're going to format it with the date time of that date, and we're going to convert it to a string, and then we're going to return this. So when we go into this loop, we're going to be able to simply call this getDayOfWeekName function on our forecast date, and it will print Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Thursday, whatever. Let's run a quick test and make sure this still works. Okay, you can see everything is working right. We're getting the correct dates. So this function has really helped us simplify our code. But I'm going to ask you another question. While we're improving this, why don't we take this daily forecast that we have here, and why don't we obfuscate this away into a function like we did with print today's weather? So that instead of all this stuff, they would simply have print today's weather and then print forecast weather, or whatever we decide to call the function. So I think first of all, we're going to create a new function called print weather forecast. It's going to be type void because once again, all we're doing is printing something to the command line. So we've copied and pasted our loop of daily forecast in here, and we're just running the exact same code. But note that as an argument into this function, we passed a map of string dynamic called weather data into this application, and we're creating our list of daily forecasts here. So basically, we just took this code that was up here, we copy and pasted it all into this function, and so now in this function, all people are seeing is print weather forecast. So look at this. We now have something that used to be many lines, and it's reduced to 5 lines of actual code and a few comments. Let's go ahead and test because I am not entirely sure that this application is going to work. We always need to test. Wow, you can see this application is working extremely well. I don't know about you, but I am really pleased with our progress at refactoring. So now we've got a pretty nice looking application, but I'm noticing a couple of lines here. What if we could combine these 2 lines of code into one? Well, first of all, I want you to know that there's a question that you have to ask yourself. Sometimes abstracting code can be very beneficial and can make the application easier to read and reuse. However, there are sometimes it can actually become slightly more confusing. So I want to go ahead and show you an example that could be borderline of making it more confusing to read instead of easier. What I propose we do, instead of defining a variable zip code, we just use the getZipCode function right here. Now, there is one thing we need to do before we do this. We need to take this getZipCode function and convert it to a future. I'm going to explain why. So I've gone ahead and converted getZipCode into a future of type string, and the function has to be void async, and we're returning the zip code. In the same way, nothing really changed. But notice I have gotten rid of the zip code variable up here, and now we have await getZipCode. The reason we had to convert this into the future is because we need the zip code. We need to wait for the zip code before we can wait for the call weather API, before we can JSON decode. Now, do you see how while this works, this is starting to get a little bit convoluted? In this case, where you are able to reduce things down to 1 line of code, it's going to be a matter of personal preference and how you like to engineer your applications. I personally actually really like having this reduced to 1 line. The complexity is not too great and it's not too difficult to read, especially if you use useful comments that help you understand it. But I understand some people don't like nesting a function in the argument of a function in the argument of a function. This is personal preference that I just wanted to illustrate for your purposes. There actually is a way that we can make this look a little better, and it's by using what's called a named argument or a named parameter. I'm going to show you how to do that. It will make it slightly easier to read, although in this case, not that much. So how do you set up a named parameter? Well, in this example, we're going to go to the call weather API. We're going to go to this function that we've created. You can see here we're taking a string called zip code. Well, if you want to make something a named parameter, you merely wrap it in curly braces. And since this function cannot work without the zip code, we're going to add the tag required. So this allows us in our callWeather API function to define zip code named with a colon and then await zip code. I know it's not a huge improvement, but for me, just being able to see that what we're calling here is the zip code and we're using the zip code function makes this easier to read. In fact, in general in Dart, I think named parameters or named arguments are useful and I use them as much as possible. In fact, one of the only situations I can think of where you wouldn't use a named argument or parameter would be as if you have a function that only takes one piece of input. But even then, it can still make it easier to understand. Now again, this is personal preference. You're gonna have to develop your own methodology for architecting applications, or your place of work might set up certain requirements for application architecture. But either way, I wanted to show you this example. So there's one last thing I want to do to improve this application, or at least the readability of this application. And that's to take all of these functions here and abstract them away to a new file. So we don't need this here, so we're gonna delete these. And you'll notice here in our main file, we no longer have any of these functions. So where did they go? Well, look up here. We're gonna import a file called utilities.dart. If you haven't created it, in whatever the path is you would like it to be stored, in this case, I just have it in my lib folder. You can put it wherever you'd like. You're gonna make a file called utilities.dart, and you're gonna copy and paste all of the functions that you created in there. Now, please note, because this is a separate file, you are going to have to import some of the things that you need to use in here. So we had to re-import the IO library, the international.dart, conf.dart, and http.dart. So this allows us to do two really interesting things. We don't need to import all of the functions in our main file anymore, which makes this quite simplified. And our main file is this main function that consists of 4 lines and comments. We took a kind of obtuse and large file, and we've simplified it to the point where almost anyone, even if you've never software engineered before, could understand this. There's a print statement, welcome to the weather app. There's a variable called weather data that's getting all of our information. And then we're printing the daily and forecast weather. This is super simple. So before we close this video out, we're gonna make sure our final application works. So this file, on my case, is called weather13.dart. Let's enter our zip code. Everything functions amazingly, and we have created an application that people can understand. That's awesome. And I just wanted to have a little chat with you. There's quite a few things we could do to improve this application still. One of them, for instance, would be we could convert this application to an object-oriented paradigm, and that would give us more fun and creative ways to organize our functions, methods, parameters, and attributes. But this is a very simple application, and I wanted to do it in the easiest way possible. Just keep in mind, code, in many ways, is like an art form. How you lay out your application, how you split things into files, whether you make everything object-oriented or use some functional programming, these are all things that are going to be up to you. But most importantly, they're going to be dictated on the size of the app, the quality of the app, what the app does, and what other people you're working with. So I think we did the best we could with this application, knowing that it's just an example, and we worked within the limitations we had. So this application is more simple and it meets our needs. But there's one thing that you may not have noticed about this application, or perhaps you have, in which case you're cursing at me and calling me an imbecile. We haven't added error handling to this application. What does that mean? Well, if something is wrong with the API, if we can't connect to the server, if our username changes, if our API credits expire and we don't have access to the API anymore, the application is just going to break and return to us really ugly error messages that, frankly, we don't want the user to see. So in the next video, we're going to take this application that we've refactored to be more abstract and simplistic, and we are going to refactor it again to add in higher quality error handling. So I really want to encourage you once more, before you go to that video, try to do it on your own. So I don't know if you remember, but we talked about a try-catch block, which is great for catching errors. And in our utility for callWeather API, you'll notice we also have some if statements here based on the response status code. So here's a little bit of a challenge for you. So why don't you go ahead and go to weatherapi.com and look up all the error codes and check in this function to see if you can add some more error handling in this block instead of just status code equals 200. Special bonus if you know how to do it with a switch case block. You could also consider trying to integrate the try-catch block on your own. But either way, If you don't know how to do this, we're going to do it in the next video, so join me then. I really hope you've enjoyed this. And please, if you have any questions, comments, ideas for future videos, leave them in the comments below. I promise you we're going to answer them. And if you can find it in your heart, like and subscribe so that we can keep making these videos. Thank you.